Right now, today, the price you will pay for coffee, beef, and pasta this fall has already been decided. Not by inflation happening around you this week, not by anything you will read in tomorrow's headlines. The decision was made months ago, buried inside shipping contracts and import paperwork that almost nobody outside the supply chain ever sees. Economists have a name for the gap between that decision and the moment it finally reaches your receipt. They call it the pass-through lag, and according to federal pricing data, that lag typically runs between 12 and 18 months, which means the trade policies signed back in 2025 are only now arriving at the shelf. 9 grocery categories are sitting inside that window at this exact moment, and one of them is going to surprise you, because it is not the product most people assume is protected. This is not a video about panic buying, and it is not a video about hoarding. It is a video about timing. There is a difference between reacting to a price after it lands on your receipt and understanding, weeks or months ahead, why it is coming and how large the move is likely to be. That difference is what separates someone who feels blindsided every time they check out from someone who simply already knew. So before we go through the list, it helps to understand why this lag exists in the first place, because once you see the mechanism, every item on this list stops looking random and starts looking like a pattern. Food companies do not raise prices the moment a new import cost appears. They usually have inventory sitting in warehouses that was purchased under the old pricing, and they have existing supply contracts that lock in costs for months at a time. Retailers do the same thing, working through existing agreements before renegotiating at higher rates. Analysts who track this pattern across past commodity cycles have found that the full cost of a new tariff or supply shock generally takes about a year to a year and a half to show up completely at the register. That timeline lines up almost exactly with where the calendar sits right now. Trade measures that took effect through 2025 are landing on shelves precisely in the middle to late part of 2026, which is exactly the season we are heading into. It helps to picture this the way a supply chain analyst would rather than the way a headline usually frames it. Think of a warehouse as a kind of buffer, absorbing the shock before the consumer ever sees it. When a new cost enters the system, that buffer does not disappear overnight. It drains slowly, shipment by shipment, contract renewal by contract renewal, until eventually there is no more old, cheaper inventory left standing between the new cost and the shelf price. For most food categories, federal pricing analysts describe that drain as taking somewhere between 12 and 18 months from the original policy date. Some categories move faster because contracts are shorter, and some move slower because a retailer negotiated a long-term agreement before the new costs applied. That variation is part of why 9 different categories can all be inside the same general window without moving at exactly the same pace or by exactly the same amount. If you want to see how this plays out in real time as we go through the rest of the list, staying subscribed means you will catch the next breakdown the moment a new category crosses into that same pricing window. Because this lag effect does not stop with 9 items, it keeps rolling forward every quarter. The first category sitting inside that window is beef, and interestingly, this one has almost nothing to do with tariffs at all. This is a domestic supply story. The United States cattle herd has been shrinking for years, and current estimates put the national inventory at around 86 million head, which is the smallest herd size since 1951. That is not a typo. Ranchers have been working with the tightest cattle numbers in roughly 7.5 decades, and herds do not rebuild quickly. A cow takes close to 2 years from breeding decision to a calf reaching market weight. So even if ranchers decided today to expand their herds, the effect on supply would not show up for a long time. Federal agricultural forecasts currently project beef and veal prices rising around 5.5% in 2026, and retail data has already shown ground beef averaging close to $6.83 per pound in the middle of the year, a level that would have sounded extreme just a few years ago. To put the herd number in perspective, agricultural economists describe cattle inventory as moving through what is called a cattle cycle, a slow, multi-year rhythm of contraction and expansion that has repeated for decades. Right now, the industry sits near the peak of the contraction phase, and forecasts suggest prices are likely to stay elevated before any meaningful relief arrives, with some projections stretching supply recovery out toward the early 2030s rather than anything close to next year. That is a much longer runway than most people assume when they see a single price increase on a label. If you are someone who plans meals around beef as a primary protein, this is the category where advanced planning around sales, bulk portions, and freezer storage will matter most this fall, since the underlying cause is a structural supply issue rather than a temporary spike that reverses itself quickly. The second category moves us into the import side of the story, and it starts with coffee. Coffee sits at an unusual intersection because two of the largest supplying countries have both been hit with new duties at the same time. A duty near 50% applies to coffee coming from Brazil, the world's largest coffee producer, and a separate 10% duty applies to coffee from Colombia, which supplies roughly a fifth of the coffee consumed in the United States. Because coffee cannot be grown domestically at any meaningful commercial scale, there is no substitute supply chain to fall back on the way there sometimes is with produce. Consumer price data has already shown coffee prices up roughly 21% year over year, which is a dramatically faster pace than the low single-digit moves coffee usually sees. If your household coffee budget already felt tighter this year, this is the specific mechanism behind that feeling, and it is not expected to ease unless trade terms change or new supply sources scale up, which takes years, not months. What makes coffee a useful case study for this entire video is that it shows how two separate pressures can stack on top of each other rather than cancel out. Coffee growing regions have also dealt with weather variability affecting harvest yields in recent seasons, so even without any trade measures at all, some upward pressure on price would likely exist. Layer a 50% duty and a 10% duty from the two largest supplying countries on top of that, and the result is a category where the increase cannot be traced back to one clean headline. For a household trying to manage this specific cost, buying in larger shelf-stable quantities during any temporary promotional dip and storing coffee properly in a cool, airtight, low-light environment tends to preserve both the product and the value of that purchase far better than buying small amounts reactively each week as the price continues to climb. From coffee, the same import pattern extends into olive oil. A base duty of 15% now applies to food imports coming from the European Union, and that includes olive oil, along with wine and a range of specialty goods that many households buy without a domestic substitute in mind. Olive oil in particular is a category where the United States imports a large share of what is consumed, so a duty at the border does not get absorbed by domestic producers the way it might with a crop grown at scale here. It moves fairly directly toward the price on the shelf, once existing inventory works through the system. Pasta follows a similar path, but with an extra layer stacked on top. Beyond the 15% base duty applied to European food imports, a number of major pasta exporters are now facing an additional anti-dumping duty, and when the two are combined, the total tariff on some imported pasta approaches or exceeds 100% of the product's value. For context, that is not a modest cost increase passed along in cents. That is a structural doubling of the import cost for a product that many households buy weekly and rarely think about as an import at all. This is a case where the lag window matters enormously, because a lot of pasta currently on shelves was purchased before these combined duties fully applied, and the true cost is still working its way through the pipeline. Dry pasta happens to be one of the more forgiving pantry items in terms of shelf stability, so for households that regularly buy imported pasta, this is a category where a modest pantry buffer built up gradually, rather than all at once, can smooth out the transition as the older, cheaper inventory disappears from shelves over the coming months. Stepping back from any single import category, sugar and sweets deserve their own mention, because federal forecasts currently place this category among the fastest growing in the entire grocery basket, with an increase near 6 7/10% projected for the year, well above the 20-year historical average for that category. This is a case where several pressures layer on top of each other at once, from ingredient costs to packaging materials, rather than one single tariff being the whole story, which is part of why this category tends to surprise people who assume price increases always trace back to one clean cause. Sweeteners and many baking ingredients depend partly on imported sugar and cocoa inputs, and both have seen their own supply pressures internationally, separate from any United States trade policy, which is a reminder that not everything on this list traces back to tariffs specifically. Sometimes the lag window and a genuinely separate global supply story happen to land in the same season, and sugar and sweets are a clear example of that overlap. Packaged non-alcoholic beverages sit in a related position, with forecasts placing this category's growth near 5.2% for the year, a rate driven in part by the same coffee and ingredient pressures already discussed, but extending into bottled and canned beverages more broadly. If a household stocks shelf-stable drinks as part of a broader pantry strategy, this is a category worth checking before assuming current shelf prices will hold through the fall, since many bottled and canned beverage lines share ingredient and packaging costs with the same categories already discussed, meaning a price move in one often shows up in the other within a matter of weeks. Now here is the item that tends to surprise people, because it breaks the assumption most shoppers walk in with. Most people assume fresh produce grown close to home is somehow insulated from all of this, since it does not have to cross an ocean. But a meaningful share of fresh produce sold in the United States, particularly tomatoes, avocados, limes, and bell peppers, is imported from Mexico, and current trade measures allow duties of up to 25% on Mexican goods that do not qualify for exemption under existing trade agreement rules. Some products are shielded by those exemptions and some are not, and that inconsistency is exactly why this category catches people off guard. A shopper can watch the price of one produce item hold steady, while a nearly identical item 2 feet away on the same shelf moves noticeably, simply because one crossed the border under an exemption and the other did not. This is the category to watch most closely if your household relies on fresh produce as a lower-cost alternative to the beef prices we already covered, because the substitution logic only works if the substitute itself is not also moving. A practical habit worth building here is simply checking the country of origin sticker or shelf label on produce that has historically felt like a dependable, low-cost staple, since the exemption status can shift the relative value between two options that used to be roughly interchangeable on price. Leaning toward domestically grown produce in season, where it is genuinely available, tends to sidestep this particular pressure entirely, without requiring any dramatic change in how a household shops. Fish and seafood round out the picture from a slightly different angle. Federal forecasts have flagged this category as growing faster than its historical average pace for the year, and a significant share of seafood consumed domestically is imported, which ties this category into the same, broader trade cost structure affecting coffee and olive oil, even though seafood rarely gets discussed in the same breath as those two. Frozen seafood tends to hold its nutritional and quality profile well over time, so unlike fresh cuts, this is a category where buying during a lower-priced window and freezing properly can meaningfully soften the impact of the increase, provided packaging and storage are handled with basic food safety in mind. Finally, cereal and bakery products close out the list, and this category illustrates something important about how grocery pricing actually works. It is rarely one ingredient driving the whole category. Wheat costs, packaging materials, transportation, and imported specialty ingredients used in many bakery and cereal products all layer together, and federal data has flagged this category as moving faster than its long-term historical average for the same reason sugar and beverages are moving faster, which is that several smaller pressures are compounding at the same time, rather than one obvious headline cause. So that is the full list, and it helps to hold it in your head as 3 separate groups rather than 9 unrelated items. The first group is beef, driven almost entirely by a domestic herd at its smallest size in 75 years, with no tariff involved at all. The second group is coffee, olive oil, and pasta, driven by import duties working through the 12 to 18-month lag we opened with, where the origin country and the size of the duty determine how sharply the price moves. The third group is sugar, packaged beverages, fish and seafood, and bakery goods, where several smaller pressures, from packaging to ingredient sourcing to partial import exposure, layer together rather than tracing back to one clean cause. And sitting slightly outside all three groups is Mexican produce, the item most people do not expect, because it exposes an inconsistency most shoppers never think to look for, where two nearly identical products sitting a few feet apart on the same shelf can move in opposite directions, depending on a single exemption rule neither product advertises. None of this happened last week, and none of it is going to resolve itself next week either. The 9 categories on this list are simply the ones currently sitting inside that pass-through window, where the decision has already been made and the shelf price simply has not finished catching up. That is genuinely useful information, not because it tells you to panic, but because it tells you where your grocery budget is likely to move before your receipt does. A household that knows beef is tracking toward a multi-decade high can plan around sale cycles and freezer storage ahead of time instead of reacting after the fact. A household that understands why two nearly identical produce items might diverge in price can make a more informed choice at the shelf instead of assuming the difference is arbitrary. One last thing worth saying plainly, because it matters more than any single number on this list. Everything you just heard is about pricing patterns and market timing, not about nutrition, and it is not financial advice either. How any of this fits into your household's actual budget or eating habits depends on circumstances only you know. So treat this as context for planning, not as a set of instructions to follow blindly. If any of these categories make up a meaningful share of your regular spending, it is worth checking current pricing for your own situation, rather than assuming national averages apply exactly the same way to your local stores. The pattern underneath all 9 of these categories is the same pattern that runs through almost everything in this space. The prices that feel sudden almost never actually are. Somewhere behind every one of them is a decision made months earlier, quietly working its way toward the register, waiting for the inventory and the contracts to catch up. Beef was decided by a herd count taken years ago. Coffee, olive oil, and pasta were decided by trade paperwork signed back in 2025. Even the categories that feel like background noise, the sugar, the bottled drinks, the bakery aisle, are following cost decisions that were already made before this season even started. None of that means every price move can be predicted perfectly, and it does not mean every category will land exactly where current forecasts suggest, since these are still projections built on the best available data rather than guarantees. What it does mean is that the direction, and roughly the size of the move, is already visible in the data for anyone willing to look a season ahead instead of reacting after the fact. The households that notice that pattern early are not doing anything dramatic. They are not clearing out shelves or panicking over a receipt. They are simply paying attention a season sooner than everyone else, adjusting timing where it makes sense, and treating a grocery list the way someone might treat a household budget for any other predictable seasonal expense. That is really the entire idea behind this channel, and it is worth carrying into whatever list you are building for your own home this fall.